understand like colonization and displacement and how people like colonized people, diasporic people have learned how to make do with what they have access to, like make the best out of the resources that they have. So like how is it that we're allowing our colleagues and our students to go hungry, you know? Like that, how can they do their work? How can they actually teach? How can they do their academic work on an empty stomach? Like that's just, to me, I feel like we have to really ask these questions, and we have to humanize people that we work with. We have to humanize our students, and we have to really dig deep into those issues. And we have to be proactive. We can't just say like, oh, it's not important. It really is important.
Dr. Saldaña, can you tell us a little bit about what food sovereignty is? What does it mean?
So for me, food sovereignty has to do with people's right to their foods, the right to not just nutritious foods, but foods that are a part of their ancestral diet, their ancestral memory, their ancestral practices. So food sovereignty is, to me, a way of ensuring that our communities do have access to those ancestral foods that are life-sustaining, that are life-giving, and that are going to keep our communities well. Educate our communities, you know, particularly communities of color, about our ancestral foods, you know, our ancestral ways of not just in terms of like the ingredients and the foods, but also how to prepare foods that challenge, you know, the colonial diet, or in the United States, it would be the standard American diet. So it's not just integrating foods that are indigenous to the land, but also learning, you know, culinary techniques that our ancestors, you know, created or innovated, right, before colonization. So I think it is fills me with great hope to think that food sovereignty could exist within institutions of higher education, which are colonial institutions, right, that are rooted in settler colonial practices and ways of being. So food sovereignty within institutions of higher education means that people, you know, that students, right, that staff, that faculty would have access to foods that are life-sustaining, that are a part of their ancestral diet, where they would learn, for example, how to prepare these meals, how to engage not just in terms of the culinary techniques, but learn or unlearn, right, and relearn how to relate to the earth, how to engage in practices of respect and reciprocity with the land and our waterways, with our more than human relatives. So that to me is what I imagine food sovereignty to look like in institutions of higher education. I saw some beautiful yuccas over here that are about to bloom by the parking lot. The stems, I would say in another week, are going to be full of those beautiful flowers, flor de icate, right? I know that our Central American relatives use them in their food. They're the beautiful white flowers that come out of the yucca plant. But students would have access to that. People would probably have access to juniper berries or nopales, you know. The food is right here. We are surrounded by it. And so, but yes, I think part of it is educating the community also, like what are the native foods here, how to prepare those foods, because oftentimes, for example, I teach a foodways class and many of my students don't cook. You know, they're students, they work as well, so they're working for wages, or they're also caregivers because they live in intergenerational households. And so that means that they don't have time to cook, right? And sometimes the knowledge hasn't been passed down, right? Because of capitalism, because people are literally just trying to survive. So how can we create communal spaces where we're sharing that knowledge, where we're also inviting our elders into conversation, or people in our community, the knowledge holders, the people who know the recipes? And how can we create spaces of communal learning where we're sharing that knowledge, where we're ensuring that that knowledge is going to be passed down, where we're preparing meals. So it's also shifting the model of like this individualistic model versus a communal model. So I think what happens in a lot of like, let's say nutrition classes, right, that I've seen in certain spaces, right, is that they have a workshop, they teach you how to cook a meal, and then the assumption or the expectation is that you're going to go back to your silo, back to your home, and you're going to prepare that. But what we need are communal spaces where we're sharing, we're preparing a meal, we're sharing, we're learning, and we're eating together as a community. And I feel like that's something that we're missing. So for me, as an educator, I thought one way that I could do that was by creating a class, right? But I opened the class to people in the community. So people were able to audit the class, you know, people who worked in health, right? People in community health, people who worked with nonprofit organizations, people outside of academia, you know, who haven't been to the university and this was their first experience at a university. So I think creating these spaces that are open to the community, where we're inviting people that maybe aren't necessarily attached to the university, but that's one way of unlearning and relearning what it means to be human, what it means to do things with community, what it means to care, not just about yourself, but others. And it really is a paradigm shift. That's part of decolonizing how we understand the world and how we teach and how we learn, is relearning how to engage with others, you know, from a place of respect, from a place of mutuality and reciprocity. It's acknowledging that everyone is a holder and creator of knowledge, to quote from Chicana feminist Dolores Delgado Bernal. And I imagine that food sovereignty in a pantry looks like having a community garden attached to it as well, you know, where you're growing quelites, where you're growing calabazas or chiles, where you're growing corn, frijoles, tomates, like foods that are native, where you're harvesting nopales. I know on this campus, I see a lot of native foods. I see a lot of plant life, like right over there, that's a yucca that is about to bloom. And those yucca flowers are used in cooking in a lot of traditions, a lot of communities. So I imagine that a food sovereignty pantry has an educational component, like a community education component, has a collective cooking component where people are cooking, where there's intergenerational sharing of knowledge, intergenerational conocimiento. I imagine that people will be also growing their foods and learning about plant life and how to integrate these plants as integrating plants as for their culinary uses, but also their medicinal uses. So a food sovereignty pantry would provide a space for people to learn or relearn indigenous approaches to cooking and preparing meals. For example, how do you nixtamalize corn? You know, what does that technology look like? And it's a technology that indigenous communities have used for thousands and thousands of years. You know, how to prepare tortillas on a comal, how to roast, roasting, steaming, cooking over brasas. Those are all indigenous cooking techniques, right? Even how to cook in an earthen pit is an indigenous cooking technique. So I imagine this earthen oven or this earthen pit, right, where people could prepare meals, you know. We have a lot of beautiful green space here where we could create a meal and we could all share that meal. We would invite our families. So that's sort of what I think of, right? Reclaiming those culinary techniques. Because, I mean, we live in a city like San Antonio where we do have a diabetes epidemic, where people, particularly people of color and also poor people, are contending with a number of diseases and health-related issues because of the colonized diet, because of the standard American diet. It is literally killing people in our communities. So how can we reclaim those cooking techniques and that culinary knowledge and that medicinal knowledge. That's imperative. I would say that a food sovereignty pantry would engage more in a mutual aid approach where everyone is either taking care of the community garden or distributing some of the foods, right, that you're growing, distributing quelites, distributing nopales, or cooking a meal, or having an educational workshop on how to prepare nopales. You know, what can you do with a pot of beans? You can make a number of dishes with a very simple pot of beans, pot of frijoles. You can make enfrijoladas. You can make a bean salad. You can make a simple just bowl of frijoles with quelites. So there's a number of different foods that you can prepare with very basic life-sustaining foods like tomatoes, corn masa, beans, and knowing a good balance. Our ancestors knew that balancing or combining foods like beans and corn was a dynamic duo. They understood that this produced a complete protein for one's diet. So I imagine I imagine a pantry that's rooted in a food sovereignty model to kind of have these components. So I would say that something like this is very much needed and very important for our graduate student population because they don't often have the support, you know, even financial support. You know, they don't have as many opportunities for scholarships, right, that maybe undergraduate students have. They might not have access to community or the traditional campus life, right, access to that support system. So, you know, because they are working full time and they're taking classes in the evenings, there has to be a way to ensure that our graduate student population does have access to a food pantry that is accessible to them and where they are also preparing meals, right? Unlearning or relearning how to prepare meals in community with and for their families. So yeah, like I've heard people use the metaphor of fuel. I just need, like, food is fuel. I just need fuel in my body. You know, it's like, wow, you know, like fuel is actually killing our planet, but food should be life-sustaining. You know, it should, we should think of ways to give back to the earth and give back to our communities and not harm our waterways, not harm our earth, and always give gratitude for what the earth provides, what our mother provides. So I think that would be beautiful to have something like this at UTSA.